Art is a language. It's a visual language. Art is communication. Art is entertainment. Art is educational and informative. Art is therapy, and art is therapeutic. Art does not need to be difficult to learn, and art is not only for those quote-unquote born with talent. And for those in doubt, there is no subject that's been exhausted by already having been. Any idea, any concept, any message has the potential to be explained a million different ways. My goal and hope is that this show will help all of you to understand these points and offer solutions for learning, building that ideal portfolio, advancing your skills, or level up to that next great plateau of understanding and performance. And I would also like to share with you many amazing artists who speak clearly and boldly in the work they do and push the boundaries of our craft. This show is catered to all forms of 2D and 3D art, and I hope all of you will find something beneficial in each episode that could help you on your way on your personal artistic journey. Thank you all for stopping by. Now let's get into the studio and level up. Hello, I'm Ron Lemon and welcome to Level Up. In this episode, I'm trying something a little bit different. I've invited a student in to ask me questions so that I can give more spontaneous answers while I'm demonstrating those answers. I usually find that when I have a conversation with somebody, more information comes out and good information comes out surrounding the subject and not just the subject alone. So I'm hoping that this one will be a little more inviting and have a lot more information for you. This is the first part of a 5-part series in drawing the figure for every use possible. We're going to be starting with the armature, which is the understructure or the foundation for the figure poses. If you get this pose correct in the armature stage, you're 90% finished with it, without detail, without likeness, and without rendering. It's much more spontaneous and feels more alive if you get this particular stage correct. It is the most important part of building the picture. If you can hold on to it all the way through to the finish, you'll have a good one. Dylan Spence is the student that I've invited in. You won't be hearing his voice because I've transcribed his questions, which have become timestamps. So if you're looking for specific information, look for the timestamps and you can find that. In the future, I would like to invite other people in. I'm also going to be starting a Discord server so that you can follow along with these classes, you can exercise these classes, and you can leave your work over there. And at the end of each of these episodes, I'm going to take student work and I'm going to critique it. Or I'm going to take professional work and critique it, whatever ends up over there. And I think that'll be more engaging, I think that'll be more fun, and it will serve many more purposes than just giving you information, which is what I want these to do. I want them to be as interactive as possible with limits because I don't want to put you on the spot. So anybody that I bring in, I'll transcribe the questions so you won't be a part of the audio. You'll be a part of the experience though, which is what I need. When it's scripted, I do okay with it, but it feels a little bit stiff. And again, the information is wedged down to just the pertinent information for that subject. Where with these kind of spontaneous demonstrations, a lot more information flows, a lot more information that's built around what we're describing. Trying to replicate the experience that I have in my classroom with my students. There's a lot of good information that goes around that I wish I could record and give to everybody, but it just doesn't happen like that. And that's what I'm hoping will happen with these shows. All right, with that said, let's go ahead and get started. And again, this is episode 1 of a 5-part series, Masterclass in Building the Figure. Let's get started. This episode is about the armature. It's the understructure of a pose. It's the basic foundation to build everything on top of. The armature has proportion to it for the height, the width, and the depth. It is the basic container for the skeleton, the most complex of all the shapes that we have to draw for the human form. It's a basic construct of this particular complex form. It's an animation tool in addition to it being a three-dimensional tool. If we remove all the details, the muscles, the features, the fingers, the toes, we're left with just this basic form. We can still get an extremely dynamic pose just using these basic shapes. For standing poses, for seated poses, for reclined poses, and for action poses. These pages come from a book that I've generated for this year's Comic-Con, a small preliminary book, which I might put up for sale over on my Gumroad store pretty soon. I'll let you know when that happens. This is also an absolutely useful tool for sketching, for finishes, for character designs, for storyboarding, for comic books. You can use it for anything. It's an excellent preliminary tool. And again, it doesn't require any detail. It has everything built into it that we need to find poses, to find the poses in action, and to find the attitude or the feeling within the poses. For the next hour, we're going to go over some of the concepts of the armature, the basic building blocks for a pose. This particular episode is dedicated to this tool. I'm excited to share this tool with all of you and explain it a little more thoroughly. So again, this first class is about the armature and how to work with it. When I sit down to draw an image and there's a figure involved, the first thing that needs to be established is the gesture of the figure. The gesture tells the story of the situation. It's going to be something to the effect of blocking out a very quick, rudimentary meaning there's no details, there's no likeness, it's just a simple armature. The armature, in the case of when I teach figure, I have a specific armature that I utilize with very basic shapes. The arms and legs are made up of cylinder forms. And the body is this sort of, I use the term pillow for it. And it's resemblant to the types of pillows that we sleep on, where there's an indentation in the middle with four corners. To keep the gesture lively, there is drawing straight lines, which I see a lot of people do when they sketch. They draw these very stiff, straight lines to get the pose started. And while the straight lines do connect together visually, they have a resemblance to a robot, right? It's like almost like a manufactured object instead of it being a fleshy, lively, emotive human being. And people, even with their sedate poses, still have a flow to them in some way. The lines that I draw with for the cylinders are curved in such a way, and they curve this way in the flexing direction. Our body is in the arms and the legs are made up of these stick bones that have ball joints at either end. The stick portion of the limb doesn't sit directly in the middle of the ball shapes. It sits off to one side. And the interior is the flexing side. This is where your bicep will go. This is where your forearm muscles will cradle the bicep, while on the outside are your extension muscles. And they don't have any space to crowd up into with other muscles. They're completely free of that. So the interior of the arm, or the flexing side of the arm, has to be designed in such a way for all of those muscles to fit properly when we do flex our arms or our legs. So I call these lines flexion lines because of that. And it's just to identify the action of the line. So when I'm drawing the limbs, I try to make a conscious effort to put a slight curvature into them to give them that feeling of movement and flow, regardless of whether they're foreshortened like this is or they're at length like these are. And then the ends of the arms and the legs are part of so there's three shapes that can be complicated. There's the torso shape, that's the pillow. There's the hand shape, which is kind of like a spade or even a diamond if we want to think about it like that, with the 2 points of the diamond removed. And the rest of this would be finger mass, hand mass with the wrist included. So somewhere out here at the end of the arms and at the end of the legs, I have to make a cutoff point where we can see the foot independently of the leg and we can see the hand independently of the arm. And again, these are all very basic shapes that I'm working with. Now, this language that we're speaking here with the armature is a container space for the complex skeleton. We should be drawing all of our figures from the skeleton up, but that would be an impossible task for all the illustrations and all the images that we draw. And not to mention, there's a bunch of redundant steps here that after a while, it doesn't really make any sense to do those. We can just start with almost the finished figure, the muscles and the tendons included. But for somebody who's first learning, it's important that you dig deep under the muscles and under the tendons and find the tightest, sharpest spots, which would be the subcutaneous points. Each joint has subcutaneous bones, which means you can see the bones directly under the skin. And the rest of our body, the muscles cover the bones, so we don't see the skeleton, and therefore we don't think about the skeleton. But if you fixate in between the muscles instead of on the muscles, then you'll start to notice the skeleton right away. And that is what this container space is all about. The legs and the arms are going to be narrower. The neck is going to be narrow because we're really shrinking it down to the size of the bones. And then the torso space is also narrow. If we look at this pillow shape at a front view, we'll have 4 corners here, 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 and here. And then we have these 2 indentations. The indentations represent the bottom of the rib cage, or at least the 10th rib, which is on the side of the body, the lowest rib of the rib cage visible. The corners of the top of the pillow represent what are called the acromion processes, and that is a bone that is kind of like a little wing that comes off of your scapula. I call it an on-ramp because it goes up and over to the clavicle and then connects with the clavicle and keeps going down to the pit of the neck and spirals up and around like an on-ramp to a freeway. And then the bottom corner represents the great trochanters of the leg bones, the femur bones. So each corner and each of these indentations are an actual landmark of the human body that we can see through the skin. And the curvatures that are along here and along here just represent the space for us to place these bones. That doesn't represent muscles, although later on, if you advance the armature and make it your own, you can incorporate muscles and bones into this. I have a more advanced version that has pectoralis muscles and the latissimus muscles and even the hip muscles in the visible space of this. And then on the back, I have the erector spinae and the latissimus and trapezius as part of it. And I'm finding indentation points, which might look like shadow patterns, as well as the shape language of the muscles. Like, for instance, if we were to do the latissimus, it would go across the body over the scapulas about a third of the way up from the bottom. And then it would dive down into the tailbone. And it would be a large triangle with a line down the middle representing the spine. So you could see the left side and right side. While it's not really explaining anything, what it is doing for me is it's explaining where the muscles might be active if this particular pose is using the back muscles. So they're landmarks more than anything, even if I don't use them by the end of the pose. If we're drawing these figures, we're looking for proportions of the figure. We want everything to feel proportionate to itself. And one of the proportions that suffers a lot when drawing the figure is the head size. Here's one that's too small. Here's one that's too large. And this is relative because each individual has their own scale, right? Some people do have a smaller head than their body. Some people do have a larger head than their body. Children have larger heads than their body size. But when we're trying to be very specific about the character, depending upon the age of the character, the gender, and so forth, we're also concerned with the likeness of sorts. If you're working on your own project, then you'll know the scale of the characters that you're working with, and you can make the adjustments accordingly. If you're learning, though, there's an ideal proportion that we would first start with when we learn, and that would be from the head to the bottom of the pelvis, which, let me change this pillow shape, it's a little rough looking. And I want to make sure that all of these lines have a convexity to them, meaning that they poke outward. The body is considered like a giant water balloon, And if we make all of the lines when we first start the core of the pose drawn outward, then we're considering that. I've seen people gesture the figure where they do lines like this, or they do the bottom half like this and the top half like this, and it deflates the human form, and there's still information that needs to be put in the same way that people use ball joints at the joints instead of just letting the lines pass through each other. And passing through each other creates a natural corner where it should be. Now, going back to the proportions here, on the body, we would be 4 heads from top to bottom here. And there's another way we can measure this just to make sure that we get to that point. And that is that there's 1, 2, 3 different divisions from the head to the bottom of the pelvis, or the bottom of the torso, pillow shape. From the head to the neck, from the neck to the bottom of the rib cage, from the bottom of the rib cage to the bottom of the pelvis, are equidistant to each other in an ideal situation. And ideal is relative. This is how we study. We try to look for the perfect formula. And then from there, all human beings are a deviation from that, but at least you have a starting point. You can make things perfectly balanced and then throw them out of proportion. If this is something that you studied, you're going to have those proportions in mind, and they'll probably get in the way of a likeness at first when you're first building with it, which is perfectly fine because at least you have a starting point, where many of us just stare at a blank page wondering how to start it all. Then from the bottom of the pelvis down to the bottom of the feet, one section here and one section here, each of those should be roughly equidistant to each other. So we could say then that from top of the head to the bottom of the pelvis is 4 heads tall. And that would mean then that this section should also be 4 heads tall from the very top to the bottom. So we're looking at 8 heads tall for the human form down to the foot. I'm drawing these feet flat like an orthograph because we are thinking just in terms of proportion in an engineering sort of way for the moment here. And then the length of the arm, because that can get screwed up pretty easily too. There's a little bit of a flub factor here in this first measure, but your elbow is roughly the same length as your rib cage. So you could say that the elbow could end right along in here. But if the arm is out, how do you measure that? Well, you draw a circle from that point. And that represents the direction and the length of this particular limb at its full length. And wherever we place it is still the same full length in a flat rotation sort of way. But we can also use an ellipse, which is for foreshortened limbs. And it's the same thing. I want to start at the bottom of the rib cage. I want to use the shoulder as the halfway point and then draw the rest of this ellipse up and over. And again, this is only for the first half of the arm. We still have the second half to add to that. So coming back down here and looking at the point of measure, the wrist bones land directly on top of the great trochanter. So that's another point of measure. But what happens here is it makes each of these points equidistant to each other, and that's not how the arm or the leg works. Each section between each joint is roughly 1/3 smaller than the previous section. So if we were to take this and divide it into thirds, 2/3 of this is the length of this. Then dividing this in thirds, 2/3 of this is the length of this. And that goes for both the arms and the legs. Now, with that being said, we have this figure that we can build roughly all the shapes with in proportion to each other. We know that the hand would be 2/3 the length of this, or smaller or bigger, again, because the individual is going to have large hand or small hand, and we would design it accordingly. This gives us a starting point now so that when we look at our figures, really like in a seated or kneeling or reclined pose or even a foreshortened pose, we're really not going to be able to see these proportions at all. But having drawn this head to this torso 4 heads tall over and over and over again gives me a formula that I can then see regardless of the dynamic of the pose, and it helps me reshape things. And then of course on top of all of that is the likeness, which might shape things a little differently even further. Because we study from photos probably about 70 to 80% of the time, and this is being generous because I'm thinking of the people who also take life drawing classes, which I want to stop and make a point of really quickly, that in order to really truly understand what you're building, you have to do part of that from life. You cannot do everything from photographs because photographs have a number of different mysteries. A camera doesn't capture all of the vivid information the way our eyes see it. So this is color and value related. So the entire value range and the entire color range is not visible at all. We're losing, depending upon how cruddy the camera is, we could be losing 30 to 40% of the color. We could be losing 30 to 40% of the value. So there's that deficit. The other deficit is that we just look at these flat photos on our phone or on an iPad or maybe sometimes on a screen when we're working, and we don't really correlate those photos as being in a space. We just look at the figure as an object and we try to copy that object. On top of all of this, we're copying, which is the wrong thing to do. What we should actually be doing is recreating. When you're recreating, and that is what we're doing here when we're building with this armature, we're designing a figure, and when we get to all of the linear passages, we place these ellipses over the top of the figure, and what that does is it helps remind us that the figure is actually built in perspective. So if I can remember the three-dimensionality of this, and I can put in these ellipses, my imagination starts to see the full form of this. Now, as far as perspective goes in those photographs, what we're in search of is the camera lens. The lens is what's taking the picture. A standard tripod, I believe, is 38 inches to 40 inches high. So if you were to put a camera on a tripod that you fully extend the legs out on, you're looking at roughly close to around 4 feet, 3 to 4 feet, somewhere in there. And that's where the majority of photographs are shot, is right around that elevation. So we're looking at somewhere in the middle of the figure. But sometimes we might elevate that tripod, or we might actually stand on something like a bench or a stool, or even climb a ladder and shoot down at the model, which is going to throw off the horizon line a little bit. And sometimes we might even shoot from the ground. Now from the ground, we're looking at 9 to 18 inches tall for a tripod. When you extend the legs out and flatten them out, it's roughly between 9 and 18 inches tall. So we have 9 to 18 inches, we have around 40 inches, and then we have above the head. Those are the three standard places where we will see things shot. On candid photography, we're just out and about, we're using our phones, and we just hold it out in front of us. There's all sorts of variation as to the elevation of it, but keep in mind that usually what we do is we stick our hands somewhere in front of our face and we look through the screen to the subject matter to make sure everything is lined up. So it's roughly, I'd say in that instance, the camera is around neck level in a candid photo. Now, what that means is when I'm drawing from the photograph that I want to place a horizon line across where the camera elevation is. And then the way photographs work, this semi-square here has an X through it. And the camera will always be center vertical to the photograph. But that doesn't mean that it'll always be dead center, because if it's on a tripod and say we rotate the camera slightly upward, because we can do that, then the horizon line is going to be lower in that instance. And if we turn the camera downward, then the horizon line is going to be higher. And we're accommodating for that camera tilt as well by saying that the horizon line is in a different spot. Well, what this does is it gives us a rational point of departure between above and below the horizon line. The perspective changes. As we climb upward into space, and let's say we had like a large column that the character is standing next to, the column is going to open up more and more as we ascend. It's going to get closer and closer to a full circle. Around the horizon line, it's going to flatten out to a very thin 5 to 10 degree ellipse. And then on the horizon line, you could say that the ellipse would be just a straight line. And then that same action takes place below the horizon line. And as we descend, we open up and open up and open up even further. Now, that's our arms, that's our legs. So arms and legs as well can sometimes be to the left or to the right of the model. That same elliptical opening takes place regardless, because it's all coming from the center outward. And as it gets further and further outward, it becomes more and more dynamic. So whether it's horizontal or it's vertical, knowing where the camera is that departure point for us to tell the story of change in all of these different directions. So by finding the horizon line now, then I want to project 2 lines forward called measuring lines. And this is what you use when you're finding vanishing points and boxes in 3D space and so forth. We're using these vanishing lines, though, to find the floor plane or the ground that the person is standing on. And what I usually do is I draw a ground plane effectively the same scale as the model's pose. So if in this case of the model here, I might draw the floor plane out to here and over to here, so that way the entire figure is on the floor and I can relate everything above this to the size of the floor plane. And for the floor planes, I also make sure that I add a grid to it, because if I just drew these five simple lines, this one, these two, and these two, once I get to the figure, I'm no longer paying attention to those other lines because I'm concerned of the pose. So with a grid on the floor, and it really doesn't matter how many of these subdivisions you create, but the more of them that you do create, the more of a measuring tool it will start to feel in our mind, because we're seeing things in measure. In the same way we look at a ruler, we know that we're going to measure with it. It has increments on it. And this reminds us that, oh yes, everything that I'm doing in the picture space is measured. Now, this exercise of finding the horizon line is not an easy one. It does take some practice. And looking at photos, it may not be intuitive at first. But the more that you practice doing this, the easier it will get. And one of the exercises is to take your own camera and a subject, stand on a ladder, shoot down at the subject, climb down the ladder, hold the camera out in front of your eyes, shoot the subject, sit down, hold the camera in front of your eyes, shoot the subject, lie down, shoot the subject. And then go back through those pictures and reference what you see when it's below you, what you see when it's above you. You're looking for surfaces that are underneath or on top, and how visible those surfaces might be. When you understand how you're seeing those surfaces in reference to the elevation of the camera, then that makes it a little easier to find roughly where the horizon line is going to go. And do remember that this isn't an exact science. We're trying to be as approximate as possible, but approximation is so much better than not thinking about it at all. If I'm going to work from photo reference, I want the photo reference to be as clear as possible. So there is a difference between good photo reference and bad photo reference. Bad photo reference would be something that was shot with too much exposure or not enough exposure, so the model will end up mostly consumed in shadow, or overblown, which means that the highlights look like gigantic white spaces, like literally white, like our background. Highlights are never white. Highlights usually have some kind of coloration in them, either from the local color of the object that the highlight is sitting on, and or something referencing the color of the light source, which you'll see in there too. But because it's such a bright thing sitting on another value that's darker, our brain automatically assumes that it's pure white, instead of it actually having a temperature to it. And as far as good quality photo reference goes, that varies depending upon your need. If you shoot the model with the correct light source, then you should have shadows that you could open up theoretically with levels or curves. And I think I have a photo reference here that has some shadows that are darker. Actually, neither of these do, but I can do this anyway with this photo reference here. If I was to take a tool in Photoshop called levels, this is levels here, and levels is a histogram of your colors. And in this particular instance, there should be like a nice bell curve that comes up to the center and drops and descends on both sides, fairly equal to each other. In this case, it's slightly off because the majority of this photo is dark. So the majority of this bell curve is over off to the darker side of the value range. Now, this middle slider is the slider that I would work with. If I lower the slider, I can reduce the highlights down so I can see the actual forms underneath the highlights, because the value information is still there in the digital photo. It's just that it has been adjusted, or in the photograph itself, the photographer is not thinking about our artistic needs and is shooting for their own artistic purpose and intent. Big highlights appeared, and by going darker, we can tune those down and almost remove them, and you can see local color again. You can see the turning of the form, which is actually more important than the color, because we can judge the color from the largest portion of the figure, but we cannot judge that color if it's completely blown out like so. If it's really washed out, then we're going to have a hard time seeing the forms. We're also going to have a hard time identifying where the light source is, just because the highlight is too big. And the same thing with the shadows. Notice how the shadows opened up, and we can actually see under the arm in here, because we're taking away most of the darkness. The turning of the form is still there. All the information is still there digitally. If it was a traditional camera and then printed onto paper, we couldn't do this, because a print photo is everything that you see It's not data retained that you can then adjust. So for us in this new generation, digital photography is very artist friendly because we have so much room to open up or reduce the range of light. Hello everyone. I want to stop right here for just one moment to take the time out to thank you. I want to thank all of you who've been watching my videos over the years. That really means a lot to me. I love making these educational videos, and I have a lot of fun trying to get education to be as entertaining as possible to learn from. However, it's really demanding and it takes a lot of time. Time which I just haven't had enough of over the years. Since I'm making all the video content myself and I have other work to do, the time just isn't there yet. I'd love to get an editor on board so that I can get more videos out in a higher frequency. Ultimately, my goal was to put one video out a month, if not two, and with an editor there, I can definitely do that. If you enjoy these videos, I would really appreciate it if you would consider subscribing to my Patreon. The link is in the description below down here. By becoming a patron, you would be supporting this channel and you would be helping me get that content out at the frequency that I know you would like it, and I would feel much better getting to those numbers that I was hoping for. So with all that said, once again, thank you all. Now let's get back to the learning. This is actually kind of like an ideal photo. You can see all the form and you can see the turning of the form, which is the most important part. And you can also still see the local colors. And as you can kind of see here from one side to the other, the light source on this side is cooler. The light source over here on this side is warmer. And it's very obvious that there is a difference in temperature between the two of those because the photo is so clear. Looking at a photograph, sometimes it's hard to tell if it was shot with a wide-angle lens or a long lens. There are photos which I should probably find really quickly here to answer this question. Let me grab, hopefully this photo is the right size. Of course not. Little tiny photo. So this is a photo of lens distortion, and unfortunately this guy has a lot of hair. Let me grab another photo as well because I want you to be able to see something very specific. In this teeny tiny photo here, we have the same person shot twice, and on one of them it looks like he's missing some of his skull over here. And on this side, he looks very flat, almost. But this is actually how we would see him if we were looking at him with our own eyes. The 16mm lens is hiding the ears and making the nose extend forward because it's the closest thing to the camera lens, so it will appear larger. And anything that's receding in the photo space is going to disappear. And it's going to feel like he doesn't have any ears, but what's really happening is the cheekbones are expanding outward and are distorted from the center out, hiding the ears when they never should, but it's because of the distortion in the lens that causes this. As you're studying and as you're learning, you do want to pay attention to the photo reference that you're working from. Here's the same kind of thing happening. He was shot with a 20mm here and then rolling all the way down to 200mm. You can see the distortion changes in each one of these as we get further and further out. There really isn't as much of a change between 70 and 200 because we are used to seeing the model at around 50mm. This is what our eyes see everything at. Although when you look at the 70 and the 200, the model's head is more squarish. There's more flatness to the information, where this does have a little bit more turn of the form to it. And again, our eyes see everything in a normal way, but when we do get close to something, there is distortion even in our own eyes. And so this is kind of telling of what kind of distortions we might see there. I would like all of my photo reference to be from 50 to 200 rather than from 50 to 20. But in instances where maybe I have to illustrate something that's in a fisheye space, then I would be okay with working with any of these because it also shows the distortion. There is distortion in some photography. Knowing that this is another thing as an artist in training, you have to be aware of and you have to take into consideration. You can't just jump on the internet and just grab anything. I mean, you can, of course, anybody can do that. But if you're trying to be exacting or you're trying to be particular about the kind of reference to learn from, then you want your photos to be as standard as possible without any of that distortion in mind. When you're first learning how to draw, lighting is an issue because the more light there is, the less form you'll be aware of. One of the concepts in the beginning of learning is learning how to see shape and then translating that shape into form. Shape is the contour. If we were to just draw the contour around this without any information within, that would be considered a shape. Kind of like a hieroglyph on any of the walls in Egypt and the pyramids and so forth. They'd be very flat with no dimension or depth to it. But we don't draw that way. We draw everything with form. Unless we're working for South Park, then we could draw everything flat. But for the most part, everything that we draw has some kind of form to it. Lighting is what helps us see that form. And the more lights there are, the harder it is to find that form as a beginner. The photo that we're looking at here, I wouldn't give to a beginner student because it has two light sources. And that would throw off the idea of seeing an ideal form. We just want one light source. If we're outdoors and we're shooting with the sun, we have two light sources out there, but one is like a spotlight. The sun is the spotlight. It overshadows everything else. The sky is the other light source. In the shadows outside, they are illuminated by the sky light. But because the sun is so strong, it creates very dark and intense shadows at first glance. And of course, if we're shooting the reference with a digital camera, the camera is not going to pick up the subtlety in that shadow most of the time, and it's going to darken it down even further, which makes a great photo for us because we have a very strong light source with very definable shadows. And then the rest of the form has the turning of values, like the subtle changes in value that are right here on his chest. All of these very subtle gradations here are a result of quality lighting, although we have two of them right now in this picture. And like I said, two light sources can confuse a student. One light source will make for a very clear representation of light and a very clear representation of shadow. A lot of students, when they're first rendering, equate many of these halftones that are on the figure as shadow tones. And they're going to look like halftones in the light if there's multiple light sources, which again is why we want one single light source on the model when we're first learning. But as you move forward as more of a professional or you're building illustrations and so forth, the lighting is determined by your idea. And however many light sources you need is whatever it takes. But at that point, you've already educated your eye and you've educated your mind to what to look for in the first place. There's a thing called heavy-handedness. There's another thing called light-handed or feather-handed. What was the term I heard somebody use? Feather fingers, I think is what it was called. Feather fingers was drawing too light. Everything was so light that we couldn't see the picture. Heavy-handedness is everything is so dark it looks like a coloring book or a stained glass window with the lead lines between the pieces of glass. Neither of those are favorable. What we want is something somewhere in between where we can control the line weight. Very much like if you're playing on a piano, you can bang on the keys really hard or you can touch them very lightly, and it makes a completely different sound in either of those instances, differently than if you're striking the keys with regular amount of pressure. And that's the same thing that happens when we're drawing. We have this range to work with. Now, line weight is a big deal. It can generate for us distance, it can generate for us movement, and in either of those instances, we don't want that line to be like this. If it's coming from the distance getting closer to us, we would want that line to be drawn like something like this, where it feels like that's in the distance and this feels like it's up close to us. So knowing that in one pull of the line I can get all of that at once, the goal while I'm learning how to draw is to also learn how to control my tools. When I'm drawing the initial armature, I try to stay fairly light because I'm still sketching and I'm still ideating at that point, which means I'm putting down the concept on paper or in digital format here, but I'm looking for the concept and I don't quite know how to represent it yet. And I'm sketching in. If I want the head to lean over a little bit, then I'm going to draw the second oval and reposition the neck before I erase this one so I know that I've clearly moved it into a new position. But in the sketch form, if I make everything really dark, then I have to compete with that line. Now, given this is digital format, and I could always just use another layer to retrace my drawing, but that's extra steps. And if I can avoid making extra steps while I'm working, I will be more efficient when I do work. So one of the many things that we have to take in as a beginner, we have to learn shape, we have to learn form, we have to learn line control, we have to learn line weight control. And the same thing with shading. If we shade haphazardly, we have all of these holes that we have to fill in, and if we just don't know how to do that, we create more and more noise. So it's also important that we learn that there is a way to put tone down instantly, but it does require that same pressure sensitivity. Now, if you notice with these, I have sharp edges here and soft edges here. Ideally, what I'd want is to have both ends soft so that I could keep working into each end and make it look as though I pulled the entire line all at once. Because if I have these smaller line breaks, you notice that it creates something that looks like a point or a vector point underneath it. And that's something I'll still have to go back into and remove because that's breaking up the form too much. I call these like staccato lines, and I don't want too many of those in there. I'd rather just pull the line all at once if possible. And that is another thing that a beginner has to think about. Do you scratch? This is called chicken scratching. Do you scratch the line in, which is going to involve many, many lines, and that's also confusion, or do you draw the whole thing at once? Ideally, this is where we want to get to. We don't want to do things like this just because it creates noise, it creates distraction, and it also forces us into this hesitation to make things rather than committing. And that's ultimately what we'd like to be able to do, is just commit to the lines once. And if they're wrong, then we make a change and we put a second line down to correct it. And as I said earlier about the head, I want to correct the idea before I erase the original that I did, because likely if I erase the original, I will put the correction right back in where I made the mistake in the first place, because I'm still learning. I don't know any better to move it over 2 degrees or 4 degrees. That's so subtle that I'm not computing that kind of change as of yet as a beginner. So I do need to think about that. And so again, if it's in the wrong spot, change where the lines go, then remove the other one, then commit to building in the line weight as needed for the forms you're working on. Line control is something that we have to consider when we're making our drawings. If you don't have any line control, then your lines are going to be, misshapen and maybe really messy, uncontrollable. So there's some warm-up exercises that we can do before we start drawing that helps hone in on these accuracies. One of those would be to find 2 points, draw them both, and then connect them together as quickly as possible with the line. I call this the dot dot dash exercise. Dot dot dash dot dot dash dot dot dash. Although there's a curve in that, I was still able to get to my target. And that's really all I'm trying to learn how to do, is find 2 points and find the shortest pathway possible to get to the other point and aim for it literally. The better I get at this, it's sort of like sharpshooting. I'm getting better and better at hitting my target. Then once I've done a few of these, I can then go back over that line over and over and over and over and over again. And usually for this, it's 8 times or 10 times that you would go over the line. And the goal is not to make the line so big that it's become a shape, but to try to build that exact line again and again with the same type of line weight. It's automatically going to get darker because of the number of times you repeat yourself over that. But it shouldn't expand to the point where it's become something different than the line that you first started with. There's also exercises in enclosures. So before I go into that, let me explain that there are 4 line types that we will always use regardless. We will draw straight lines. We will draw completely enclosed lines. We will draw lines that have a curvature to them, but the line doesn't come back around on itself like the enclosure does. And then there are S-curves, sort of like slalom running in the snow. These S-curves are the one particular line type that automatically produces perspective if you're aware and conscious of the line weight and the line thickness. So we would want to then try to recreate all of these line types as often as possible. For the circles and the S-curves and so forth, remember back when we first learned how to write with a pencil, I think it was in kindergarten or maybe pre-kindergarten, that we had these pieces of paper that had large lines on them with little dashes in between. And then we would write the alphabet using that middle line as the separation point for the upper and lower half of the letter. The same thing with S-curves, right? The change in the S is somewhere at that midpoint. And that would be the same thing for an oval. I want the oval to be divided equally in half, and I want to rest the oval against the bottom and the top of those lines. This will also occur with ovals that are pitched, ovals that are thin, and perfect circles where I don't have any lines to work with, and perfect circles. They're like letter types. And in fact, for those of you who have family members who say, I can't even draw a stick figure, well, yes, they can, because if they know how to write numbers, then they can draw stick figures. These are the limbs, these are the heads. So circles and lines we're already very aware of doing, but we have a tendency to freak out about it being an art thing. And we lose context with writing. We've learned how to do these things already. As we're training, we want to revisit this whole process. For an oval that's tilted, if you need the center line drawn in first so that you have multiple targets to work with, then by all means, make it as easy on yourself as possible doing this. And then with S-curves, there's various types of S-curves where the sweeping lines have more or less of an arabesque to them. And then there's S-curves where we can practice thick to thin and light to dark. And because this is digital, it's not going to be the same as a pencil, but there's variation in those S-curves. And I'm learning how to control when I'm pressing down and when I'm lifting up. And all of these exercises should take you, when you're first learning, it should take you roughly 30 to 40 minutes. And as much as that sounds like a lot of time, it really isn't. We should be actually doing these, when we're first starting, maybe all day long, because these things should be second nature or intuitive to us. When we pick up a pencil and we sit down to draw, this is going to help us get past that awkward and uninformed stage, by knowing that we have the confidence to make these kinds of lines because we practiced them enough. But again, the dot, dot, dash with straight lines, and then drawing back over those straight lines multiple times to trace them, which is going to help you with your dexterity. Then the letter exercises, and again, it's a dexterity thing, to be able to stay between these lines and change the shape halfway through is both dexterity and the physicality of drawing. If we can't feel our pencil, and that's why digital sometimes is a little bit deceptive. While we are drawing in a digital state, we're using a plastic nib on a plastic surface, and there isn't any resistance. Where on paper, the pencil and the paper create resistance between each other, and we don't have what is called muscle memory. Muscles don't have a brain, so they can't store memory. But it's sort of like a nerve thing. Our nervous system feels this, and it becomes something of a memory. I should be able to feel my way through the oval, through the straight line, through the S-curve. Memory is going to serve me well to recreate those lines. There are plenty of exercises that you can do to help generate better dexterity, which in turn is going to give you more confidence to keep moving forward in our studies. How would we know when we are making a figure if the figure feels right or not? And in order to kind of understand that, this is again where if we can draw the ground plane into the picture, then we can relate the figure to the ground plane, right? Gravity is the beast that we have to fight with here. If I'm drawing a figure and I draw it like this, clearly we can see that the figure is falling over. But that's because we're aware of the figure looking off balance. When we're first learning how to draw, we might not notice that this is an off balance figure. We're just really happy that we were able to get through these few shapes. However, if we stay away from the drawing long enough and then come back to it, hopefully our rational brain will kick in and say, that looks like it's falling over. Everything that we're drawing should have that ground plane in the picture, because that is going to remind us that gravity and ground is at play here, even for a drawing that's on a blank piece of paper. Each figure that we're drawing stands in the real world of some sort. Kind of keep in mind that when you draw pictures on paper, it's the same thing as taking a photo. You're creating something that represents reality. And you should be able to recognize when reality is faltering. So we're looking at how the figure is in relationship to the ground plane. If I draw the figure, let me try to draw something here where it might be hard to judge that. If I put this leg over here, oh yeah, I know what I can do here. If I put this leg over here and then I lift this leg up like this, that figure is off balance, although you could say it's in motion. But it's off balance because of this leg over here. And the further over I make it over this way, now this has tilt to it, which means this figure is now going to fall over in this direction. As a standing figure goes, you have two types of poses that you'll always be working with. An A-frame, which I'm going to overdo here, an A-frame, and that could also mean as subtle as something like this, but that's an A-frame figure where both legs are part of the balancing act. And then you have favoring the weight on one leg. And that's going to be something like this, where one leg is bent or out farther. Maybe we put the leg out over here. But the other leg, the weight-bearing leg, is going to be directly underneath the head because it's these 2 points on the figure are always trying to stay in balance with one another. In addition, we will also need to change the hips so that they accommodate for the length of the leg over here. If we keep this line straight, then we're growing this leg longer the further out we take it. And then we just need to make sure that this always remains under the head. The most important aspect of that pose is to keep this leg directly underneath the head. And for an A-frame, it's just a matter of creating a similar kind of spread between both legs, then the whole figure should feel balanced in that way. Because of our symmetry, we have 2 arms, 2 legs, we have 2 eyes, 2 ears, 2 nostrils, and 2 corners of the mouth. There is a line that's really important in figure drawing, and that's the center line. So down the middle of the pillow shape, we have a left side and a right side. Down the middle of the head, we have a left side and a right side. Now, ideally, when we first learn, we're going to draw from straight forward on because there's no change in perspective or change in that balance between the 2 sides. But if we're talking about the head first, we're looking at the head in reference to 3D space, and we're going to rotate it into what we call a 3/4 pose. A 3/4 pose with a portrait would be something where the tip of the nose is very close to lining up with the cheek on the far side of the head. That could be a little distant from it, or it can be overlapping slightly, but it's in between profile and straightforward. And the other problem with doing something in this position, especially once we advance the drawing further, is if we're looking down through the form, our faces are not flat like this. Our faces actually have angle to them. The eye socket over on the far side is going to be shorter looking than the eye socket on the near side because we see this more directly on, where this is turned away from us enough to make both of them feel very different. So we're going to have an imbalance happen between the left side and the right side because of that. Once we place the center line, we then want to find the side plane of the head, which we, in figure construction and in, say, figure abstraction, we want to generate a sense of balance between the 2 sides. And we use these ovals as the side plane where the ear is attached, and this roughly comes down through the temple of the skull, along the cheekbone, into the chin. But what it does is it recreates the edge that we are looking at in 3/4 view. This edge over here is this edge over here. What we're trying to do is find those 2 edges so that we define what sits in the front versus what sits on the side of the head. Once this is established, then we know, okay, eye socket number 1 has to fit in this side over here. Eye socket number 2 has to fit in this side over here. And that should help us create a sense of balance between the 2 sides. If we're looking at the torso in 3/4 view, the pillow shape is going to change in its form. We're going to have one side with a long line, and that's going to mirror the center line. and the other side is going to have a bend in it. This represents the rib cage that we see in 3/4 view separating from the hip, where on the far side what we're seeing is the pectoralis muscle and the abdominal wall plus the oblique all in line with one another. That creates a longer, more stable rhythm from the top to the bottom. There are no undulations as of yet until we make them with the muscle rhythms. And remember that the armature is not muscles, it's a container for the skeleton. This line over here is just representing the furthest most boundary for the skeletal forms. We still will have contour to it. The same thing with the head shape. It creates a midpoint on a form that doesn't have flatness to it. Both sides recede back from the center line. And the challenge then would be, well, how do we get everything in here to fit in? And it would be the same answer as the skull. We need to find the side plane. And once we find this side plane on the front of the body, everything else that we have over here is considered on the side of the body. So the hip bone will be over here. The acromion process will be over here, as well as the connection of the arm. That gives us a place to begin where we have a better chance of creating a balance between the two sides, albeit there will be one side that is receding more than the other because of the change past the center line. And that's perfectly okay. As long as this line over here is in the picture, it will mirror this one and give us a difference between the front and the side. So with all that information now in your head, which is probably more information than you need at the moment, what I'd like to do is build something as a sketch. Now, keep in mind that sketching comes in different flavors. If we're not really sure what we're doing, then we might just kind of fumble around a little bit until we find something. And then once we think we see that thing we're looking for, then we can go back around and solidify it. If I was to, let's say, volleyball. I don't really play sand volleyball, so I don't know very many poses that people would take, but I'm kind of thinking in mind, somebody who's diving forward and they're extending their arms out in front of them to hit the ball, back up and over. I'm going to first loosely block in using all of the shapes that I know, the cylinders for the arms and the legs, the pillow shape for the body, an oval for the head. And at this point, I'm not going to put a neck in there yet, especially if it's going to be something like this where there's a lot of overlap to the forms. I'll find the neck afterwards. I want something that allows me as much flexibility as possible. So without connecting things together too exacting, because if I put a neck in here, then I'm going to put the head right here or try to get it in line with the neck just because there's a certain orderliness to what we do and how we practice it. If I keep the neck out of the picture, then I can put the head right here, or I can put the head down here, or I can put the head over here. I have a little bit more variability to work with. And again, now with this, I want to think about what the action is. So this person is diving forward and they've jumped into the air, they're diving forward, and then they're going to hit the ball with their hands out here. I want something in here that creates a flow. I want it to be exciting looking, but at the same time right now, I'm only thinking about this action, not in representation to an illustration, but the action itself. This is an exercise both in memorization, so it teaches you memory, and in invention, which, of course, if you saw somebody doing something, you can say, well, I'm not really inventing, I'm recreating. There's that word again, recreation. And that is exactly what you're doing. You're recreating the pose. But you're also inventing it because you don't have any reference to work from at this point. You're relying completely on your memory. But guess what? You're always relying upon your memory. When you look up at the model in a classroom and then you look away to draw on your page, you have to remember what you saw to put it down on paper. I don't think we think about that very much. So we don't necessarily say we're working from memory, we're copying. No, you're working from memory. Every drawing that you're doing is working from memory. And so that is kind of what I'm doing now is I'm working from a memory of what I've seen before. I put this foot in earlier and I put in this leg earlier, but it was the wrong size. I could just tell in the way that I'm looking at the piece that it was too small and it was a little bit out of character or out of context to the rest of the pose. And that gives me a chance to sketch some more. And that's the nice thing about this initial kind of sketching is it allows me to move things around because I haven't put in any details yet. And this is another one of those psychological things that happens to us. I spent the last half hour putting that foot in. I drew all those toes and toenails, and you're telling me to move it. That means I have to erase everything that I did. So not only am I removing the drawing that I'm satisfied with, but I'm also erasing all the work that I've done so far and starting all over again. I don't think I'm going to erase it. And that's what most beginners do is they compare what they're doing to the amount of time and the success of actually getting a drawing done. But if the drawing doesn't work, it doesn't work. And we have to be willing to sacrifice whatever we're building to make it better. In this early sketch phase, I'm more than happy to remove, like, let's just say we don't want the leg over there, but we want to put it over here and get this pose to feel even more like a diving pose. Then I'm going to go ahead and change the position of this leg and using the ellipses that helps me relate to the perspective of the piece. And one last thing on the ellipses, this is an arc, this is an ellipse. An arc doesn't tell you of the full form. It only shows you the surface that you're looking at. We want to see all the way through it because this volume is going to help us understand the position of the figure more easily and more vividly, especially once you get used to the idea that ellipses are form and not just circles in a drawing. It gives us a sense of weight and volume. And that's what I'm looking for now. So I can erase this leg completely and I can just work with this here. And you can see that there's a gesture. It might look like I copied it from a photo. It might look, for some of you who play volleyball, like completely wrong, but to me, it looks like somebody diving forward at this point. And if I had this person over a ground plane, then we would know exactly what kind of action we're looking at and how dynamic that action actually is. So when I do these types of sketches and I'm fleshing out an idea, I will relate each one of these poses to a ground plane. That way I can judge what I've done, and if it's out of character, out of context, or out of balance, then I can always make changes to it. When we study, there's a part of us that needs to be academic. But academics shouldn't be the thing that leads your finished artwork. When you're learning this academic stuff, everything is going to be cut and dry. There isn't going to be anything fun and fanciful about it. For every 2 or 3 drawings that you do academically, you're also going to want to do something of your own. Let me give a different number here. If we did 10 drawings a day, then in a playful way, let's do 5 drawings. Or even another 10 if you have the time for it. But I'm looking at time factor here. We spend the majority of our time learning, which is great. But parallel to that, you also need to be creating. It's that creating stuff that I was mentioning earlier that kind of shows you what you're lacking. But at the same time, you're not concerned with what you're missing or what you have. You're just generating because this is what you're going to be doing. If you don't work in the creative space, which would be from memory or just gesturing things because you've got these ideas in your head and you'd like to see them, if you don't balance that with the academic, you're going to stay in the academic space for far too long. And by the time you get to the end of that journey and you're ready to build art, you have to learn all over again how to get back to that playful side of you, how to get back to that childlike playfulness that we have in us when we generate our own artwork. At least we should have that when we're generating our own artwork. I know when we're under deadlines, it doesn't feel that way. But when you're making that art, regardless of the pressure, you're enjoying yourself. And that enjoyment is going to be seen in the work. If, again, you sort of wait until the end of your training to start playing, you're probably going to have a hard time getting back to that or even recognizing it at all because you've expunged it from your mind. The only thing you have in your mind right now is proportion and balance and all of these other tools that are very academic and very cut and dry. And that's great. And, we need to be very technical, but at the same time, we also need to be a storyteller. Our storyteller side of us is not the academic side. We have to just let go of all of that. This comes back to when you know that you can do this and you can explain it, you're basically working on an intuitive level at that point. And that intuitive level needs to be slid over into the creative space where you can just have fun. And do so. Just have fun doing these armatures. Try to bring them to life by having fun doing so. And be completely fine with failing. Failing is how you succeed. You go through several failures of, let's just say, balance in the pose. We fail to create the proper balance, but we're still able to create the pose. We look at it and go, okay, this is pretty close to the gesture I'm looking for. Let me do one more, and I'm going to try to balance it out. So the academic brain comes back in, takes over for a moment, points out the rules. It's sort of like you're the artist or the warrior fighting the battle. And then there's the general who's overseeing the battle, giving the orders. And that's the art director side of you. So you get back from the work long enough to be slightly academic and slightly intellectual towards the piece rather than playful to guide the artist back into the trenches to find the right thing. And when we get back into the trenches, we know we have these orders. Find balance, find overlap, these things. But we've already drawn the pose once. We just have to draw it again and redirect the leg and the arm so it's in the right position. That isn't really going back to being academic. It's just recognizing when we were off and now we're going to go try it again. In that playfulness, hopefully we will find it and it'll still feel fun, inspiring, and alive. See, the nice thing about these armatures without the muscles, like if you can envision both of these volleyball players here being an actual person, they feel alive because there's flow, there's rhythm, there's dynamicism in them that feel real enough without details. And that's kind of what you're inspiring yourself to find, is that feeling of the right thing. Not that it visually has to look exactly like a thing, but it feels right. Most of the art that we make is two parts. When the admirer of art looks at a piece, they're not looking for technical skill. They're looking to connect with the piece. Intuitively, that person is going to know when they're looking at something that this person making the art had fun because it's in every part of the picture from corner to corner. They can tell. They don't need to be an artist or somebody who understands art to see that. It's a feeling. They see the right thing, but they feel the right thing. And it's more of the feeling part that informs them and entertains them than the seeing part of it. And there are some audience members that look at art that really only care about the technical side of it, unfortunately, or fortunately, however you want to look at that, but they only look at the technical side. They don't relate to the story at all. But most people relate to the content, not the way there. And the piece should feel that way. In your playfulness outside of the academic that you're trying to become, you should also recognize when it is playful. When you do, the work really will be, and it's probably a decent piece that you could share with others that will also feel the same way about it. There should be balance when you study. There's a part of you that needs to be academic, but then you need to place it somewhere, and that would be the playful side. For every 5 to 10 pieces you do academically, do 2 to 5 or 5 to 10 pieces intuitively, playfully. You're trying to balance the ticket. You're trying to be academic on this side, but you're also trying to become an artist on this other side, which means creative, playful, fun. And you're going to be a balance of those two when you go into the professional world. Both of those are in sync with one another. The academic is the art director. The playful is the artist in the trenches. And you need both in order to make great work. The art director in us is going to be very honest and very truthful. It's going to tell us when things are wrong. That's totally fine. That voice is a different voice than the other critic that we have inside our head that tells us we're wrong, we did things wrong, you're bad, you shouldn't have done that. And we eventually need to recognize the difference between those, especially when we're making art. We can be extremely hard on ourselves. I have a few students that are very hard on themselves. When I see greatness in their work, they don't even understand why I'm saying any of that. They think I'm crazy for saying that. But what I'm looking at is their improvement on every level. They're looking at something else. I don't know what it is specifically that they see that's preventing them from seeing what I see, but it's there and it's powerful, and we all have it. I have it too. I have an internal critic that gets in my way all the time. But when I get to the art table, what I try to do is silence it. And I silence it through quick meditation. I'll listen to music and get myself amped up. Like I'm going to go out on a run and I want to be really powerful in my run. So I'm going to listen to music that really gets me going, and it's going to get rid of all of the doubt and all the trepidation. In a way, we sort of have to do that in the beginning of each session, is we have to expunge that critic from our mind. We have to push it into the background for a while so that we can enjoy ourselves. Otherwise, we're going to get in our own way. Then at the end, we can't allow that critic to come back, because it's going to say, oh, all of this sucks. Why did you spend all your time doing this? And it really is going to be a powerful voice that prevents us from moving forward sometimes, almost like an artistic paralysis. We have to understand that we cannot be like that. We cannot be harsh and just say, this is bad. What we should be saying is, I feel a little off with this piece. What is off to me? What is the thing that might not be there? And what that does is, instead of inviting the critic in, it forces you to sort of look around and question things a little bit more, like the art director would. The good art director, the kind that really wants us to improve and grow. So they're going to give us their thoughts on what can improve the drawing. And we need to get ourselves to that space, which takes a lot of training. It may be months before you can get that dark critic out of your system, the dark shadow in us that overcrowds the headspace and prevents us from seeing goodness or that we're enjoying or anything else. It tries to shut all of that down. What we need to realize is that, again, it's a balancing act. I do need a critic in there, but that critic can't be so loud and so overbearing that it prevents me from moving forward. And that's a matter of reframing what I say to myself each time. And instead of giving myself, and this happens to us all the time, we are our own worst critic, because instead of saying, well, I could improve this by making the shadows lighter or getting rid of most of the shadows, or the arm was too long, so I'll just make it a little shorter. Instead, we just say, this picture sucks. That's the critic that we have to remove from our system, which means you are your own worst enemy, because words matter, even when you say them to yourself. And the more you hear yourself saying those words, you don't realize it, but you're doing more damage to yourself than somebody else telling us that, because you're doing it more frequently and you don't realize it. But each time those words come out, it's one step backwards rather than one step forward. So as soon as you hear that voice going and you hear those types of words, can you shut it off really quickly and reframe the question so that it's more productive, it's more creative, it's more instructional, it's more helpful to us. But we need that critic to become a more useful voice rather than the voice of doubt. This is another exercise that it's going to take repetition for us to remove it from our system, but we can do that too. By doing that, you're going to have a better experience, a more positive experience, and you'll have that confidence there with you. You'll have it, you'll carry it with you moving forward, and you won't doubt it because you've trained it. You know that everything is working for you at that point instead of working against you. This is almost a bigger job and responsibility for us to take action and work against than just learning these academics ourselves, like all these academic tools. That's one thing, but getting that voice to turn off or turn down is even bigger. And it requires a little bit more work to do so. And it might feel forced at first, but it is something that you really do need to practice. Otherwise, that voice is the voice that's going to prevent you from doing the work you want to do in the future. Well, I thoroughly enjoyed this episode, and I'm hoping to do more of these in the future. How did you like this episode? Please leave comments below. I'll be reading everything. I'm also going to set up a Discord server for those of you who'd like to try this work. You could go ahead and leave your work over on the server, and each time I make another episode, I'm going to pick 5 to 10 images, and I'll do a half-hour review of the work at the very end, doing traceovers and explaining what works really well with the homework or with the work that you leave behind. Again, this is for all levels. This isn't just for beginners, this is also for pros. If you're following along and you would like a comment on your work, absolutely post it up over on the server. Thank you again for all coming in. I'm looking forward to future episodes and working with all of you. Take care, stay creative, and level up.